I had it all, or at least that's what everyone around me thought. To them, I was the definition of success, a former NFL player living in one of the most beautiful cities in America, married to the love of my life with two perfect kids. I had it all: the mansion, the fast cars, the sponsorships, the endorsements. People admired me, even envied me. It was everything I dreamed of when I was just a kid, watching the game from my small hometown in the Midwest. But that was the problem, wasn't it? The dream life was exactly that, a dream. A carefully crafted image that I built for myself. The truth, it was nothing like what I had imagined in those quiet moments of solitude, watching the sunsets and envisioning what I thought would be my greatest accomplishments. I live in Los Angeles, the city of stars, the epicenter of both success and despair. A city where every success is celebrated but also scrutinized, every joy shadowed by the weight of pressure and expectations. People don't see the cracks that form beneath the surface. I didn't want them to. I hid them well. It's hard to even know where to start, but I'll try. Growing up, I never had much. My parents worked tirelessly, giving everything they had just to make sure we were fed and had a roof over our heads. They were loving, and I never once doubted their commitment to me. Still, I had a fire inside of me. A fire that burned to be more than just ordinary. I wanted greatness. And like many young boys, I thought sports was the way out, the way to escape poverty, the way to feel special, to finally prove to the world I was someone. In high school, the first real whispers of possibility started. I was fast. I was strong. But more than that, I had something inside of me that couldn't be taught. It was instinct. It was hunger. By the time college came, my name was being tossed around in locker rooms and sports bars. The NFL scouts started calling. They all told me that my future was set. The offers were there. All I had to do was show up, do the work, and execute. It was a new world, one I had worked my whole life to enter. And so I did. The NFL came calling, and I didn't just answer it, I embraced it. I was drafted, and I became one of the faces of the league. National TV appearances, contracts worth millions, and opportunities beyond what I ever thought possible. Everything I'd worked for came rushing toward me in waves. The bright lights, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of accomplishment. But with all that came a price. No one tells you that the highest highs often have the lowest lows. There were the expectations, the pressures to constantly perform, to be flawless in every game, every season. Every mistake was scrutinized, every inch of your private life exposed. You're not allowed to be human when you're on top. You're a machine, a product. But even machines break. What no one saw, what no one knew, was the deep, gnawing feeling inside me. That despite all the fame, all the money, all the accolades, I still felt like something was missing. I had a family, yes, a beautiful wife who was with me through the hardest parts of my career. We met in college before I had a single endorsement, before I had the fame or the money. She was my grounding force, the one person who truly understood me, the person I could be vulnerable with. But even she couldn't ease the doubt, the emptiness I felt creeping into my soul. There was this constant whisper in the back of my mind, a question I couldn't silence. Is this it? I wasn't sure. I'd hear people talk about faith, about a purpose greater than the physical world we live in, and yet every time I tried to approach it, I felt unsure. Sure, I said the right words. I went through the motions. I'd talk about God when it was convenient, but deep down, I had my doubts. Big ones. I wasn't sure I truly believed the things I said. I wanted to, but there was always this quiet voice that told me it was all just words. Sometimes I would get down on my knees and pray, but the words felt hollow. I knew I should feel connected, but I didn't. I could go to church, I could talk about Jesus, but I didn't feel his presence. It was like a part of me was missing, a piece I couldn't explain. I told myself I was just stressed. The pressure of being an athlete, of living in the public eye, of balancing a family and a career. But deep down, I knew something else was going on. Something deeper than just the stress of the game. But I pushed it aside. I had to. I had a life to live, a career to build. There were deals to sign, games to win, expectations to meet. I had a legacy to leave behind, or so I thought. Little did I know, everything was about to change. That day, the one that would shatter everything I thought I knew, started like any other. I woke up early, ready for practice, my mind still half foggy from the late night workout I'd done the night before. I kissed my wife and kids goodbye. then jumped into my car, the engine roaring to life as I drove toward the stadium. Everything felt normal. Too normal, maybe. As if life had become this repetitive cycle, a blur of bright lights and high stakes, and somewhere in the middle of it all, I had lost myself. It wasn't until I hit the freeway that things began to change. I remember the sensation of the car slipping, skidding on the wet pavement as the rain poured down. I tried to regain control, but it was too late. The world seemed to slow down as I fought with the wheel. For that brief moment, I thought I had it under control, that I was going to be fine. But I wasn't. The next thing I remember is the car smashing into the guardrail. Everything went dark. What happened next would change my life forever. I don't know how long I was out. Time didn't seem to exist in that moment. One moment, everything was crashing down, the blaring sound of the car smashing against metal, the feeling of helplessness. Then, nothing. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the quiet, the deafening, unnatural silence. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my heart in my ears, but there was no sound of the car's engine, no rain tapping on the windshield. It wasn't until I tried to move that I realized something was terribly wrong. My body felt heavy, unresponsive. There was pain, yes, sharp and blinding, but it was distant, like it belonged to someone else. My arms were pinned at strange angles, my legs twisted in a way that made every attempt to move them send shocks of agony through my body. But none of that mattered anymore. I couldn't focus on the physical pain because something else, something far more profound was happening. The air around me felt different. It wasn't the usual damp, heavy air that I was used to. It was something else, something thick yet light at the same time. It felt pure, peaceful. I closed my eyes trying to grasp onto the reality I knew, but then I saw it, a light, bright and soft, like nothing I'd ever seen before. It wasn't blinding, but it was enough to draw my attention. I couldn't turn away from it, even if I wanted to. The light grew, expanding, filling up every corner of my consciousness until it surrounded me completely. At first, I thought it was just a dream, a hallucination brought on by my injuries. Maybe my brain was struggling to make sense of the trauma, or maybe I was simply dying and my mind was trying to make peace with it. But the longer I stayed in that light, the more real it became, the more alive I felt. And then I heard it. It was a voice, but not just any voice. A voice that resonated through every fiber of my being. It was strong, yet gentle, deep, yet tender. My beloved child. The words echoed through my soul in a way that made every inch of me shiver. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like those words were meant for me. Like they knew me. Knew everything about me. The parts I had hidden, the doubts I had ignored, the questions I had pushed away. The voice spoke again, and this time I couldn't resist. You are not alone. I have always been with you. I wanted to respond, to speak, to ask who this was, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't find my voice, not in the way I thought I should, and yet there was no fear. There was only peace. A peace I had never known, despite all the success, despite all the glory. The light faded, but I could still feel its presence, like a warmth wrapping around me, comforting me. Slowly, I became aware of something else, something moving toward me through the light. At first, it seemed like a shadow, but then it solidified, becoming more tangible. A figure. It was a man. But not just any man. His presence was overwhelming. His face was not like any face I had ever seen before. It was not like anything of this world. His features were soft yet commanding. His eyes, I will never forget those eyes. They were filled with compassion, understanding, and a wisdom that I cannot begin to describe. It was in that moment that I realized who this was. I didn't need to be told. I just knew. This was Jesus. And in that moment, I felt small. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made me realize how much I had misunderstood, how much I had lived for the wrong things, how much I had failed to understand the true meaning of life, of faith, of love. I have been waiting for you, he said, his voice wrapping around me like a protective cloak. I wanted to speak, to ask questions, to know everything about life, about my purpose, about the world beyond what I had known. But words failed me. Instead, I could only listen. He spoke softly, but his words carried the weight of the world. He spoke of love, of forgiveness, of a truth that went beyond anything I had ever believed. I was not just an athlete, a father, a husband. I was more, so much more. He spoke of the divine love that filled the universe, the kind of love that transcended all of the material things I had been chasing, the things that had once felt so important, the things that had once defined me. But his message was not just one of love. There was also a warning. He spoke of the choices we make in this life, the paths we choose, and the consequences they carry. He told me that I had been living in a way that was disconnected from the true purpose I had been given, that I had ignored the signs, the whispers of truth that had been there all along. And then, in the midst of all that love, that overwhelming sense of peace, he showed me something, a vision. It was sudden, shocking, and it struck me to my core. I saw myself, but not as I had known myself. I saw the life I had built, the legacy I had created in the NFL, the adoration of the crowds, the applause. But as I watched, something shifted. The applause turned to silence. The admiration turned to judgment. I saw faces, my wife, my children, but they were not the faces I had known. They were distant, sad, disappointed. And I felt lost. I saw the future, and it was not what I had expected. It was like watching a film of my life in reverse. The accomplishments, the cheers, the highs, all of it, fading away. And as the scene shifted, I saw the deeper truth. I had spent my life chasing things that could not fill the void. I had placed my identity in a game, in an image, in things that were fleeting. And I knew then that if I didn't change, if I didn't shift my focus, I would be lost. The vision faded, but the weight of it stayed. The love, the warning, the truth. I had been living in a way that wasn't true to who I was meant to be. Your life has purpose, Jesus said. His voice is clear as the stars, but it is not the purpose you think. You must return, but you must change. As the vision dissipated, I felt myself being pulled back to reality, to my broken body, to the car wreck, to the life I had built. But now, it was different. I had seen the truth, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't know how to return to the life I had once known. How could I after what I had just experienced? How could I go back to the man I had been? But as the light faded and I was pulled back into the physical world, one thing was clear. Everything had changed. When I regained full consciousness, I was no longer in the ethereal realm. The peaceful light, the overwhelming love, the voice that had wrapped me in its warmth, all of it had disappeared. What remained was pain, physical pain. My body was battered, bruised, and broken, but strangely, it was the least of my concerns. I was in the hospital, hooked up to wires, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic, the beeping of machines, and the hushed voices of nurses and doctors. My head was foggy, and I could barely focus. But amidst the haze, one thing stood clear: the encounter. What I had experienced, the love, the warning, the vision, it felt more real than any moment in my life. I remember staring at the ceiling of that hospital room, trying to comprehend what had just happened. How could something so profound, so life-altering, have occurred when I was at my lowest? Why had I been shown those things? What did it all mean? I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't prayed for this kind of revelation. But now that it had happened, I couldn't deny it. The truth was undeniable. I had seen the reality of my life. The emptiness beneath the surface, the misplaced priorities, the hollow chase for fame and success. It was as if everything I had built, everything I had worked for, had been laid bare before me. But with that clarity came a deep sense of unease. What was I supposed to do with this newfound knowledge? How could I go back to the man I had been? How could I live in a world that seemed so much less real now, so much more shallow than it had before? The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. The crash had been severe. My legs were broken, my ribs cracked, and my head had taken a serious blow. I spent weeks recovering in that sterile room, surrounded by the dull hum of machines and the murmur of visitors. My wife was there every day, her face a mixture of relief and concern. She didn't know the full extent of what had happened during that time. I hadn't told her. How could I? How could I explain something so impossible to describe, something so personal, when I didn't even fully understand it myself? The days dragged on, and I found myself wrestling with something deep inside me. I couldn't go back to my life the way it was. That much was certain. But what was I supposed to do next? How could I live a life that was true to what I had experienced? How could I abandon everything I had built, my career, my fame, my success, for something I wasn't even sure how to define? I tried to tell myself that I was just in shock, that it was just the aftermath of the accident, a side effect of the head trauma. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the light, the voice, the vision, maybe they were just the product of my brain trying to make sense of the chaos. But the truth was undeniable. The peace I had felt, the love that had surrounded me, the warning that had shaken me to my core, it was too real to be a figment of my imagination. The nights were the hardest. Alone in that hospital bed, unable to sleep because of the pain and the constant flood of thoughts, I would close my eyes and remember the feeling of the light. I remembered the voice, the love, the wisdom, and the warning. I couldn't forget it. I couldn't ignore it. And yet, every time I opened my eyes and looked around at my life, I felt trapped. I was a former NFL player. I had everything people dreamt of: money, fame, a family. What could I possibly want more than that? But the truth was, I felt like a stranger in my own life. My career, my success, it all seemed so meaningless now. I had spent years chasing after accolades, after wins, after the approval of others. I had built a life that looked perfect on the outside, but it felt empty on the inside. I couldn't ignore the pull of the truth I had encountered. I couldn't ignore the fact that I had been living for the wrong reasons, chasing after things that didn't matter. But I also didn't know how to walk away from everything I had worked for. I was stuck, torn between the life I had built and the life I now felt I was called to live. That internal battle was consuming me. It wasn't just the physical pain that kept me awake at night. It was the emotional and spiritual turmoil, the doubts, the questions. What would happen to my family? My wife, who had stood by me through everything, would she understand if I walked away from my career? My children, who had grown up watching me on TV, looking up to me as a hero, how could I suddenly leave all of that behind? And then there was the world of the NFL, the teammates, the coaches, the fans. How could I explain what had happened to me without sounding crazy? Who would understand? Who would believe me? I tried to talk to my wife about it, but every time I opened my mouth, the words felt inadequate. She could see that something had changed in me. She could feel the distance, the shift in my soul, but I couldn't find the words to tell her the truth. How could I explain to her that I had seen Jesus? How could I tell her that my entire understanding of life, faith, and purpose had been flipped upside down in an instant? Instead, I kept it to myself. I buried the experience deep inside, trying to pretend it hadn't happened. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. The truth was clear. I had been given a choice between the life I had been living and a new life, a life rooted in faith, in purpose, in something deeper than anything I had ever known. But with that choice came sacrifice. The sacrifice of leaving behind everything I had worked for. The sacrifice of facing judgment, of losing the life I had built. I didn't know what to do. The pain in my body was nothing compared to the ache in my soul. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I knew the answer was there. I knew what I had to do. I just didn't know how to take that first step. The days in the hospital stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. I had physical pain to deal with, of course, but it was the emotional and spiritual turmoil that gnawed at me. The experience, the vision, the encounter with Jesus, it was still with me, lingering in every moment, impossible to escape. But I was afraid of what would happen if I embraced it, if I truly let go of the life I had built and started anew. I couldn't just walk away from everything. That was my first thought. My career had been everything. I had worked my entire life to get to the point where I was an NFL player, a symbol of success. What would people think if I suddenly turned my back on it all? The fame, the money, the recognition, it felt like a dream that so many people would give anything to have. I couldn't simply walk away from that without knowing what was waiting for me on the other side. But there was something inside me that knew the truth. That voice, the peace I had felt, the overwhelming love, it was all still there, even in the darkest moments. I couldn't escape it. I had tried. I had tried to bury it under my injuries, under the pain, under the distractions of my life, but it wouldn't stay buried. One night, after everyone had left and the hospital room was quiet, I closed my eyes. The hospital lights were harsh and cold, but the memory of the light I had seen during the vision filled me, warm and comforting. I lay there in that bed, surrounded by machines, struggling with the weight of my own thoughts, and I asked myself a simple question. What kind of man do I want to be? I knew the answer. Deep down, I had always known the answer, but I had spent my entire life pushing it away. I had filled the space in my heart with the things of this world: football, fame, success. I had built walls around myself, walls that kept me from confronting the truth of who I really was and what I was truly meant to do. I had ignored the call to something greater, choosing instead to fill the void with temporary things. But now I couldn't ignore it any longer. I didn't know how to take the first step. I didn't know how to change. But one thing was clear: I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back to the person I had been. I couldn't go back to the false sense of security I had built around my success. I needed a new purpose, and I knew it had to be bigger than me. I thought about my family, about my wife, about my children. I thought about what they would think, what they would say if I chose to walk away from the NFL, if I walked away from everything I had worked for. I thought about the expectations, the pressure. But then I remembered the feeling of peace I had felt in that moment, the overwhelming love that had filled me when I met Jesus. That love was real. It was a truth that transcended everything I had known. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. What mattered was what I knew deep in my soul. What mattered was the new path that was waiting for me. I had to take that first step. The decision wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But it started with something small. I began to pray. At first, it felt awkward, strange even. I had never really prayed before, not in the way I was doing now. My prayers weren't about winning games or finding success. They were raw, honest prayers. I prayed for guidance, for strength, for wisdom. I prayed for my family. I prayed for peace. And as I prayed, something inside me started to shift. Slowly but surely, I felt the walls around my heart begin to crumble. The doubts, the fears, the insecurities, they didn't disappear, but they no longer controlled me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving towards something real, towards something that mattered. The next step was even harder. I began to tell people. My wife was the first to know. I sat her down one night after the kids had gone to bed and I told her everything. I told her about the accident, about the vision, about Jesus. Her face was a mixture of confusion, concern, and disbelief. She had always known me as the man who chased after success, the man who had built a life based on the pursuit of fame and recognition. She didn't know what to make of what I was saying, but she listened. And when I finished telling her everything, she didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at me, her eyes searching mine, as if she were trying to find the man she once knew. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know what to say," she said quietly, "but I know this. Whatever you choose to do, I will stand by you." Her words were a comfort, but also a challenge. I knew that by choosing this path, by choosing to follow the truth I had encountered, I was putting everything on the line: my career, my reputation, my family. But I couldn't go back. I had seen the truth. I had felt the love, the peace, the warning. And I knew that if I didn't make a change, if I didn't follow the path I had been shown, I would lose everything that truly mattered. The next few weeks were a blur. I spent hours in prayer, reading scripture, trying to find clarity. I sought counsel from a pastor who had been a quiet presence in my life for years, someone I had always admired but never truly listened to. But as I began to rebuild my relationship with God, as I began to trust in the path I was being led down, something changed in me. My fear began to melt away. I started to see the world differently. I saw the people around me differently. For the first time, I began to understand what it meant to live for something greater than myself, to live for a purpose that wasn't about accolades, applause, or success, to live for love, for truth, for faith. The journey was just beginning, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer the man I had been. I had been reborn. The first few months after I made my decision were the hardest of my life. I had thought that the hardest part would be the moment of change, the initial decision to turn my back on everything I had known. But that was just the beginning. The real challenge came after the decision was made. The hardest part was living out that decision every day, in every conversation, every decision, every interaction. I had no idea what it would cost me. I remember the first time I had to face my teammates. These were the men I had shared a locker room with, bled with, fought with. They were my brothers in arms, my closest allies in the game of football. But that day, as I sat in front of them, I realized something. I wasn't one of them anymore. We were in the team meeting room after a practice. It was a typical day, but the air felt different. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of their gazes on me. They knew something had changed. They could see it in my eyes. I wasn't the same player I used to be, the same man I had been when I walked into that locker room years ago. One of the guys, a longtime teammate, asked what had been going on with me. Why was I so distant? What was this new attitude? It was a simple question, but it cut straight to the core of what I had been avoiding: the truth. I took a deep breath. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to sound insane. How could I explain to these men, these warriors, that I had seen a vision of Jesus, that I had been given a glimpse of eternity, that my life had been flipped upside down and I couldn't go back? Instead of the bravado I used to have, the tough exterior that protected me from vulnerability, I just spoke from my heart. I told them about the accident, about the time I had spent in the hospital, about the vision I had experienced. I spoke about the peace I had felt and the overwhelming sense of love that had filled me, a love that I couldn't ignore. I told them that I couldn't live for the same things anymore: fame, success, the approval of others. There was silence in the room when I finished speaking. The men who had once been my brothers, my companions in this journey, looked at me with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and judgment. Some of them didn't know how to process what I was saying, while others were just plain uncomfortable. One of the older players, a man I had looked up to for years, finally spoke. "I don't know what you're talking about, man. We're all in this for the same thing: football, winning, legacy. This isn't the time to be talking about some spiritual nonsense. You've lost your edge. You're not the same guy anymore." The words stung. They cut deep because I knew he was right in his own way. The man I was, the man they all knew, was no longer the person sitting in that room. I had changed, and that change was uncomfortable for everyone around me. It was especially uncomfortable for me. But I had to face the fact that I couldn't go back. I couldn't be the man they wanted me to be. I couldn't pretend anymore. I had been shown a truth that was far greater than any football game, any championship, or any victory. And though it hurt to see the disappointment in their eyes, I couldn't deny that this was the path I had to walk. The days that followed were filled with a sense of isolation. My teammates distanced themselves. The locker room became a place of quiet judgment. I could feel their eyes on me every time I walked in, and I knew they were wondering what had happened to the man who had once been their leader. The man who had been fearless, who had led by example, who had done everything for the team. But I wasn't that man anymore. The harder part was what came next. I began to experience a profound sense of isolation that I hadn't anticipated. The more I spoke about my faith, the more people began to pull away. Friends, family, teammates, they didn't understand. They didn't know how to reconcile the man I had been with, the man I was becoming. There were moments when I felt like I'd lost everything. The fame, the adoration, the lifestyle, it all felt like a distant memory, one I could never fully return to. I saw my career slipping away, and I couldn't ignore the fact that the world I had lived in for so long didn't have room for the man I was becoming. But in the midst of that loneliness, there was something else: a deep peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from having everything I wanted. It wasn't the peace that came from success or recognition. It was a peace that came from knowing I was following the truth I had encountered in that vision, the truth that had changed my heart forever. It was a peace that transcended everything. I remember the day I made the decision to step away from football. It wasn't something I had planned. It wasn't something I had taken lightly. But I knew in my heart that it was the right choice. The decision wasn't about rejecting football or rejecting my teammates. It was about embracing something greater, something eternal. I sat down with my family, with my wife, and I told them what I had decided. There were tears, of course. There was confusion. There were questions. But there was also understanding. My wife, who had been through everything with me, looked at me with a mixture of love and concern. "You've changed," she said softly, "and I know you're scared, but whatever you decide, I'm with you. We're in this together." It was the kind of support I hadn't expected, but the kind of support I needed. And it gave me the strength to take the next step. Stepping away from football was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most freeing. In that moment, I knew that I wasn't defined by my career, by my success, or by the opinions of others. I was defined by something far greater, the love of God, the truth I had encountered, and the peace that had come with it. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be losses, there would be sacrifices, but there would also be a clarity, a purpose, and a peace that nothing in this world could take away. I had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at eternity. And for the first time, I was ready to walk the path that had been set before me. The first few months after stepping away from football were strange. They were a mixture of liberation and frustration, joy and doubt. The world I had once known, the world of fame, glory, and competition, was now a distant memory. At first, there was a sense of relief, of freedom, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But soon enough, that weight was replaced with something else: emptiness. I had lost my identity. For years, I had defined myself as an NFL player. My name, my worth, my value, it was all tied up in the game. I was known for my skills, my hard work, my ability to perform under pressure. But now, without the game, who was I? At first, I tried to fill the void with other pursuits. I threw myself into charity work, community service, anything that might give me a sense of purpose. But it didn't feel the same. I could feel the tension building in my chest as I tried to convince myself that these new endeavors were enough. But they weren't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something bigger, something deeper. Football had given me a sense of purpose, even if it was fleeting and superficial. But now that I was away from it, I was confronted with the question of what truly mattered. I found myself questioning everything. What was the point of my life now? Was I just meant to fade into obscurity? What about all the dreams I had once had? The Super Bowl rings, the record-breaking seasons, the celebrations on the field with my teammates. All of that felt so insignificant now. In light of what I had seen, what I had experienced, it all seemed like a mirage, a distraction from the truth that had been revealed to me. I turned to God as I had in those quiet moments in the hospital. I prayed, asking for clarity. I had already been shown the truth, but now I was struggling to understand what it meant for my life. What was I supposed to do with this new understanding of eternity? What was I supposed to do with the love I had encountered? It wasn't long before the reality of my decision began to set in. There were whispers, even within my own family. Some of my relatives, who had always been supportive of me, began to distance themselves. They didn't understand the changes I was making. They didn't understand the depths of my transformation, and that hurt more than anything else. I had always been the golden child, the one who had everything going for him. But now I was losing the very things I had worked for. I was losing the respect of my peers, the admiration of my fans, and the approval of those closest to me. But the more I struggled with these feelings, the more I began to see the truth of the situation. My faith, the encounter with Jesus, had changed me at a fundamental level. I had seen a glimpse of what lay beyond this life, and it had reshaped everything I thought I knew about success and purpose. The change wasn't just internal, it was external as well. I began to notice how differently I saw the world. Before, I had been driven by ambition, by the desire to be the best, to be recognized. But now, those things seemed trivial. I found myself looking at the world through a different lens. I began to see people differently. The homeless man on the street, the single mother struggling to make ends meet, the child who had been abandoned. I felt a deep sense of compassion for them. In the past, I had been too focused on myself to notice their pain, too busy chasing after my own dreams to care about the struggles of others. But now, I felt compelled to help, to be a part of something bigger than myself. One evening, I decided to visit a local shelter to volunteer. It was a small act, something that seemed almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But it was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. I was no longer the man who had walked through stadiums full of fans chanting my name. I was just another person, helping in the best way I could. As I handed out meals to the homeless, I realized something. This was what mattered. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about the people I could help, the love I could give. But even as I began to feel a sense of purpose in helping others, there was still that gnawing feeling inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being called to something more. I wasn't sure what that something was, but I knew it was waiting for me. The road to finding my new purpose wasn't easy. In fact, it was full of doubt and confusion. I had moments when I questioned everything. There were times when I thought about going back to the NFL, about returning to the world I had known. But every time I thought about it, I remembered the vision I had seen, the love I had felt. I remembered the message I had received. I couldn't go back. Not now. And then one day, it all started to click. I had been praying, asking God for guidance, when I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. It was like a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and for the first time, I understood what I was meant to do. The peace I had felt in my vision, the love that had filled me, it was real. It wasn't something that was confined to that moment in the hospital. It was something that could be carried into every aspect of my life. I didn't have to be a professional athlete to make a difference. I didn't have to be a superstar to change the world. I could make an impact right where I was in the lives of the people around me. The message was simple: love, serve, give. That was the new purpose I had been searching for. That was the path I had to walk. It wasn't about being the best at something. It was about being the best version of myself for others. And slowly but surely, I began to find my place in this new world. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was real. It was a life that was rooted in something eternal. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. It's been years since I walked away from football, and though the journey has been far from easy, I can honestly say I've never looked back. The person I was before, the man driven by ambition, fame, and success, no longer exists. In his place is someone entirely new. A man grounded in faith, love, and purpose. A man who has found his true calling not in accolades or achievements, but in the simple act of loving others. Looking back, it's almost surreal to think about the changes that have taken place in my life. There was a time when my entire identity was wrapped up in being a professional athlete. It was everything I had ever known. The applause, the recognition, the glory. But that life was a hollow shell, a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of eternity. It took a near-death experience, a brush with the divine, to show me what truly mattered. And even though the road ahead has been filled with challenges, I wouldn't trade the path I'm on for anything. In the early days after my transformation, I struggled to find a sense of belonging. I lost friends, I lost respect from peers, and I even faced rejection from people I had once considered family. The pressure to conform, to return to the life I had once known, was immense. But each time I was faced with the temptation to turn back, I reminded myself of the truth I had been shown, the love I had felt in the presence of Jesus, the overwhelming peace, the glimpse of eternity. That experience, that divine encounter, was more real than anything I had ever known. It was a truth that had set me free, and I couldn't deny it. Even when it cost me everything, I knew I was headed in the right direction. But what I didn't anticipate was the profound way my life would change once I fully embraced this new path. There were moments of doubt, of course. There were days when I felt completely alone, when I questioned whether I had made the right decision. The isolation was suffocating at times. People didn't understand, and that made the journey even harder. But in those moments of struggle, I turned to prayer, to scripture, and to the love that had been shown to me. And in those quiet moments, I found peace. Over time, I began to build a new community. It wasn't easy, but I started to connect with people who understood my journey, who shared my faith, and who were walking their own paths of transformation. Some of these people had been through similar struggles, and they became my support system, my new family. Together, we began to serve others, to love others in a way I had never experienced before. I started working with at-risk youth, using my platform to help mentor and guide young people who had faced difficult circumstances. I shared my story with them, not to boast about what I had been through, but to show them that change was possible, that redemption was real. But even more than that, I realized that my purpose wasn't just to help others, but to live out the love that I had been shown. The love I had felt in that divine encounter wasn't just meant for me, it was meant for everyone. And the more I poured that love into others, the more my own life was transformed. It wasn't just about giving back, it was about living with purpose. I found fulfillment in the simple acts of kindness, in the quiet moments of service. I found joy in helping others rise above their circumstances, in showing them the truth that had set me free. And even though the scars from my past remain, the alienation from those I once knew, the sacrifices I had to make, the doubts I still face, I wouldn't change a thing. The truth I encountered in that spiritual realm has reshaped every aspect of my life. It has given me a new perspective, a new lens through which I see the world. I no longer live for myself. I live for others. I live to serve, to love, to give. And in doing so, I have found a peace surpasses understanding. There is a verse that I hold close to my heart now. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Jeremiah 29. I often reflect on that verse because it reminds me that there is a purpose to all of this, to the pain, to the loss, to the change. God had a plan for me all along, even when I couldn't see it, even when I was caught up in the pursuit of things that didn't matter. And now I see it clearly. My purpose isn't defined by the NFL, by the stadiums, or by the trophies. My purpose is defined by the love I give and the lives I touch. And though the road has been difficult, it has also been the most rewarding journey of my life. There are days when I still miss the excitement of the game. I still long for the thrill of victory, the roar of the crowd, but those moments are fleeting. The love I've found, the peace that fills my heart, that is eternal. And that is what I live for now. I am no longer the man I was before the accident, before the encounter with Jesus. I am someone new, someone with a heart full of purpose and a spirit full of peace. And though the journey hasn't been easy, I would never trade it for anything in the world. My life has been transformed not because of anything I've done, but because of what I was shown. I walked through the valley of death, and on the other side, I found the light. And now, I walk that path with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to serve, ready to love, and ready to live in the truth that has set me free.